If there's one word to describe video game developer FromSoftware, it would be influential. They effectively created an entire genre of games, and simultaneously reintroduced the concept of unforgiving difficulty to the mainstream industry, as well as pioneering a very effective storytelling technique that's completely unique to games. None of those things are inherently good. In fact, I think there are many games that were negatively impacted by the popularity of FromSoft's games. But the Souls games themselves are an interesting series to study, particularly in how they've evolved over time now that they're 13 years and 7 games deep. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with FromSoft's Souls series of games, and part of that comes from the somewhat heated debate that surrounds them. Fans can often be vitriolic towards criticism of the games, and haters tend towards uninformed opinions based on knee-jerk reactions. So, in an attempt to stave off some of the heat, allow me to present my qualifications. I've beaten all the Souls games, save Sekiro, which I only played briefly, and some of them I've beaten many times over. I've solo defeated every boss, with the exceptions of Orphan of Kos, Dark Eater Midir, Slave Knight Gale, and Malenia Blade of Miquella, each of whom I beat with help because I have enough self-respect to not waste my time and sanity trying to do something that I'm simply not skilled enough to accomplish. And I farmed every Covenant item in Dark Souls 3 because I play offline and thus PvP was out of the question. My point is, I'm well enough acquainted with these games that my opinions are formed from hard-won experience and not just astute observation. With that in mind, I want to talk about Elden Ring, their best game to date by a wide margin, and also the game that most spectacularly brings the Souls games' flaws to light. FromSoftware has been around since the early 90s, but their first decade of game development was centered around two ongoing video game franchises, Kingsfield and Armored Core. They only began to pivot away from those series in the late 2000s, shortly after promoting Hidetaka Miyazaki to a position as a creative director. Miyazaki only entered the games industry in 2004 when he was already 29, a decision he made after playing Ico. After finishing his work on Armored Core for Answer, he was allowed to take full creative control of a fantasy game that had been in the works but was largely considered a failure by the higher-ups. That fantasy game eventually became Demon's Souls. Demon's Souls is a strange game, made even stranger by the climate of the industry at the time of its release. The AAA gaming space was extremely homogenous in the late 2000s and early 2010s, with very few deviations from the norm. Games were straightforward and gave the player power over the world around them. The exceptions were Nintendo, who will never be swayed by the times, Valve, who were still actually making their own video games at the time, and FromSoftware's Demon's Souls experiment. Demon's Souls is hard, punishing, and depressing. The world is out to kill you, and it makes it clear immediately, as the tutorial ends with a boss that you are in no way prepared to fight, let alone defeat. You have limited healing resources, healing makes you stand still, your attacks are slow, and once you commit to them, there's no turning back, and when you die, not only are you kicked back to the beginning of the level, not only do all the enemies you killed respawn, not only do you lose all your currency and have to go find it again before it's lost forever, your health is cut in half until you defeat the next boss. That's right, a game that's already built on killing you repeatedly takes away half your health bar when you die. A power fantasy this is not. Demon's Souls sold reasonably well despite being published by Atlas, and was highly praised by reviewers for its novelty. FromSoftware went on to publish the highly lauded and extremely popular Dark Souls in 2011. Dark Souls iterated on Demon's Souls' design philosophy in some important ways, but the core idea was very much the same. Piggybacking off the success of its predecessor, Dark Souls was well positioned to be a smash hit, and is, to this day, beloved by its core audience and seen as the example of its archetype. In 2014, the criminally underrated Dark Souls 2 was released. DS2 is the only game in the series not directed by Miyazaki, and therefore makes some wide-scale changes to the formula. For people who wanted more of Demon's Souls and Dark Souls, it was a disappointment, and it's definitely got some serious flaws, but I have an entire video in the works focused on what it does better than any other game in its genre. In 2015, Bloodborne came out. Bloodborne is a much faster and more aggressive game than any of its predecessors, and it's the only game of its ilk that isn't set in a dark fantasy hodgepodge, instead being influenced by the always wonderful pastiche of Victorian Gothic horror and Lovecraftian eldritch abominations. In 2016, Dark Souls 3 was released, pretty definitively ending its trilogy with the literal end of the world. Next, in 2019, Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice came out. Sekiro is definitely the weirdest of the bunch, having much less in common with its brethren. The majority of its systems are completely changed, but most people still consider it to be part of the Souls series. And finally, in 2022, FromSoftware released their newest and biggest game, Elden Ring. I'm going to criticize Elden Ring a lot in a bit, so let me say up front that I really like this game. I enjoy playing it because it scratches an itch that no other game has been able to for a long time, and it does it better than most games ever have. I think the best way to compliment Elden Ring is to compare it to its predecessors, because Elden Ring really does feel like the culmination of everything FromSoft has learned over the last decade. The core concept from Demon's Souls and Dark Souls, the aesthetic and open-endedness from Dark Souls 2, the speed and flexibility from Bloodborne, the escalation of Dark Souls 3, and the game feel of Sekiro. But my favorite thing that FromSoft has learned from their previous experiments is that their games can be nice to look at. One of the hallmarks of the Souls games are their bleak atmosphere, existing in color palettes that are very narrow and often extremely desaturated. The reasoning for that decision is sound. The worlds of the Souls games are bleak, dreary, and depressive, so the visuals of the game reflect that. But FromSoft has always had a good sense of visual design that's been hampered by that restriction. Sometimes it works well, like the kiln of the first flame in Dark Souls and Dark Souls 3, where the vast grey landscape becomes beautiful in its sparseness, the epitome of that bleak aesthetic coming at the culmination of the story. Other times, you get Bloodborne, where all but one area is the exact same greyish city blocks, completely squandering its gothic horror and Victorian stylishness. The only Souls games before Elden Ring to not fall into that pit trap are Dark Souls 2, which has its own separate visual problems, and arguably Sekiro, which substitutes a drab and depressing palette for an inoffensive and unremarkable one. Not only does every major area of Elden Ring occupy its own section of the color wheel, they're also very visually distinct. Limgrave eases you into the setting with a very traditional fantasy look. Liurnia is swamped both in its many watery areas and its many shades of blues and greens. Caelid is a scorched red mess of rot and heat, perfectly encapsulating the inescapable hell that is getting around the area. Altus looks almost pastoral in places, as is appropriate for the outskirts of the world's capital city. Mount Gelmir is a stony volcano that's as hard to ascend as it looks. The underground cities are a striking mix of purples and silvers, a look that helps them feel as otherworldly and ethereal as the story makes them out to be. The mountaintops of the giants and the consecrated snowfields are a perpetual and unending blizzard, and crumbling Farum Azula utilizes strong winds and stone ruins that seem like they could fall out from under you to drive home that the world as you know it is rapidly coming to an end. And everywhere you go, you can always see the massive golden trunk of the Erd tree at the center of the map, beckoning you ever closer to the end of the game. If I were to try to rate the games as objectively as possible, keeping in mind that FromSoft's biggest strengths have always been their innovation and influence, I would put them in the order of Bloodborne, Dark Souls 2, Sekiro, Dark Souls 3, Demon's Souls, and Dark Souls. None of those games are close to perfect, but they all have elements that work in their favor and elements that work against them. The ones at the front of the list are the ones that I think have the most of the former and the least of the latter. Elden Ring has the distinction of having very few design elements that work against it, and the benefit that the elements that do make a negative impact can be very easily fixed by modding. Combining the strengths of each previous game and keeping only the downsides that are common to all of them has made Elden Ring into FromSoft's most impressive and consistent effort to date. That said, I'm now going to heavily criticize it, and I want you to keep in mind the fact that most of these criticisms are applicable to every other Souls game, and each of those games also has the drawback of being shallower than Elden Ring. Elden Ring is so poorly balanced that I'm about to forego rhetoric and use some numbers to show it. The phrase to remember here is diminishing returns, as it's going to come up again and again. Elden Ring has 8 stats that affect the player, and you can spend your runes to increase a stat by 1 point. Each time you raise a stat, your player level increases, and the higher your overall level, the more runes it costs to increase another stat by 1 point. Additionally, leveling up a stat gives you a smaller increase in potency once you reach certain thresholds, thus diminishing your returns. Efficiency is paramount when leveling up, since every individual level is as valuable as any other. The 8 stats can be split into 3 main categories based on their main function. Vigor, Mind, and Endurance increase the amount of health, mana, and stamina respectively. Strength, Dexterity, Intelligence, and Faith increase the damage of weapons and spells. And Arcane increases the likelihood of enemies dropping rare items and increases the damage of certain weapons and spells, generally ones that inflict status ailments. The problem here is the rate at which different stats hit their points of diminishing returns. Vigor grants an enormous amount of bonus hit points per level, ranging from plus 4 at 1 point of vigor to 2 points of vigor, to plus 48 at 39 points of vigor to 40 points of vigor. In comparison, leveling up endurance gives you a maximum of 2 additional points of stamina, and once you reach 50 endurance, you can go several levels without seeing any increase at all. As for the damage bonus stats, their exact increase varies depending on the weapon or spell, but the diminishing returns start at 20 points. Of course, some weapons and spells require a heavy investment in a stat to be able to wield, but with the actual damage increase being so low per additional point, there's very little reason to continue leveling your damage stats once you've reached the threshold for the weapon or spell you want to use. Conversely, if you don't level Vigor, you will die. Keep in mind that even after hitting the first soft cap for Vigor at 40 points, late game enemies will still kill you in one hit. Leveling Vigor to the second soft cap of 60 points will allow you to survive an additional hit from late game enemies. The actual way to increase the damage of your weapons and spells is by upgrading them at the blacksmith, which requires you to acquire smithing stones from around the world. The longsword, the most standard weapon in the game, starts at 110 damage per hit at plus 0, and maxes out at 269 damage per hit at plus 25. At 20 strength and dexterity, you get an additional 93 points of damage. At the second soft cap for strength and dexterity, 55, you get an additional 238 damage. So, for 60 levels of Vigor, you get an additional 1600 health, and at a combined 60 levels of Strength and Dexterity, you get an additional 139 damage. If you don't level Vigor, you'll die even faster than you otherwise would. If you don't level your damage stats, you'll kill things slightly slower. Every single player will therefore lean towards the same stat increases no matter what weapons, spells, armor, or playstyle they favor, and they'll still get killed in 2 hits by most enemies. And that's not even accounting for the fact that certain spirit summons are effectively useless and others can double or triple your damage output. This utter lack of balance is greatly exacerbated by the fact that some areas of the games are clearly far more polished than others. The single best part of Elden Ring is the starting area, Limgrave. It's obvious how much time went into crafting the place, each part of the landscape carefully designed to draw you forward into one of several brick walls, and each of those brick walls is made to teach you something important about how Elden Ring is meant to be played. The Tree Sentinel just outside the laughably easy tutorial area teaches you that running away from certain enemies is going to be paramount. The Tree Sentinel is far stronger than the player when it's first encountered, and it is literally the first enemy that you see. When it easily kills you, you're respawned very close by, so you don't lose much time or currency to the completely lopsided encounter. Margit teaches you to go explore instead of blindly moving forward as you would in every previous Souls game, by telling you to leave before repeatedly beating you into the dirt. And the Dragon teaches you to expect some bosses to run away and launch high damage ranged attacks at you, and that even in the best parts of Elden Ring, there are times when you run into annoying and, dare I say it, bad game design. The parts of Limgrave that aren't barricaded by the aforementioned brick walls are also exceedingly well made, particularly the Weeping Peninsula, which simultaneously introduces the concept of Elden Ring's dungeons, the way its atmosphere and palette will change to signify a new area, and the small tragedies that account for the best parts of Elden Ring's story. And unfortunately, it's all downhill from here. Liurnia is also well made for the most part, but the central lake full of giant lobsters and crabs is inexcusable, and the southwestern portion of the area is very poorly thought out. Caelid is bad, ugly, full of scarlet rot that constantly drains your health, and stuffed with large and quick enemies who do too much damage. But it's also home to the trigger point for one of the best questlines of the game. That and the Radon Festival do a lot to better my opinion of it. Altus is actually pretty good. Its main issue is that it feels less like its own unique area and more like a crossroads between three others. Mount Gelmir's quality is more contingent on a very poorly thought out traversal mechanic than anything else. Either you slog through an annoying climb to reach Volcano Manor, or you do a short side quest to bypass the climb entirely. Then you either slog through a mediocre dungeon, or do a long side quest that can't be fully completed until you further advance the plot by going elsewhere, which teleports you directly to the boss fight upon completion. The problem here is that either way, it discourages one of the core aspects of Elden Ring. Either you bypass the exploration, or you bypass the story and combat. The upsides of Mount Gelmir once again hinge upon another excellent questline and boss fight. Leyndell is decent but unremarkable, ostensibly being the dungeon attached to Altus, but realistically it's only connected to Altus by location. And then comes the endgame: mountaintops of the giants, consecrated snowfields, and crumbling Farum Azula. These areas are already bland and their content is sparse. Then, all of the balancing issues destroy any sort of fun that might have otherwise slipped through. Exploring is a waste of time because you'll be killed by everything in 1 or 2 hits, and you'll already be pretty close to maxing out items and nearing the soft caps on your important stats. And then, all that remains are 4 back-to-back boss fights, culminating in, of course, an enormous boss with a huge health bar that resists all damage, is immune to all status effects, and whose main strategy consists of running away and shooting high damage spells at you. The sad part is that the final boss isn't even particularly tough, just tedious and disappointing. Really, it sums up Elden Ring in its entirety, a beautiful spectacle undercut by poor balancing that comes after an area that discourages one of its primary forms of gameplay. While I don't think the Souls games are as good as their cult following would have you believe, or even necessarily good at all, I do think they're very important. Influential, obviously, but more than that, they shine a light on things that are otherwise missing in the AAA gaming world. With Demon's Souls and Dark Souls, it was difficulty. With Dark Souls 2, Bloodborne, and Dark Souls 3, it was difficulty that wasn't completely unrefined to the point of absurdity. And with Sekiro, it was a refined difficulty while also being responsive to play. After every major FromSoft release, barring Demon's Souls, which was too new to affect the climate by itself, and Dark Souls 2, which could never have gotten a proper chance, the gaming landscape shifted a bit towards the Souls philosophy. The stamina action genre is diverse enough now to no longer be constrained by FromSoft's pace and rigidity, which is why the thing that Elden Ring does better than any other modern game isn't difficulty or story structure or any of the other hallmarks of the Souls series. It's being an open-world fantasy game that doesn't suck. Well, mostly doesn't suck anyway. Elden Ring is really close to being great, and I sincerely hope it has the same influence on the AAA gaming space that Dark Souls did, so long as that influence isn't a god-awful balance.